Hey guys, Mr. Happy here with another Diablo 3 video. Patch 2.01 has been live, and I have been trying out my Demon Hunter, most specifically my Hardcore Demon Hunter, to try and go over some of the changes, and as well as a build idea. And I have a few other build ideas that I'd like to test, but I need more time with them. So Demon Hunter, like all the other classes, has seen significant changes, and when I say significant, I mean it's probably slightly recognizable to how it was at launch, but there's been basically a lot of flat buffs to this and many other classes. Now, I'm going to quickly go over some of those buffs. As I said in the last video, when I discussed patch 2.01 overview, there's way too many changes for me to possibly go over everything. So definitely, if you want extensive changes, go into the description and check out the patch notes there. But I can give you some general gists of what has happened. Now, one of the first things that has happened that is pretty major is that pretty much every skill in the game for Demon Hunter has had its base damage increased. Now, there are a few that didn't. One that comes to mind is Spike Trap. Spike Trap actually had its base damage lowered, but the entire skill was reworked, so it now works a bit differently. So don't think it's just a flat nerf to the skill. Now, as you can see, some examples. For example, Entangling Shot, 200% weapon damage. That's definitely a buff. Bolas didn't even have its damage increased. A big one that had its damage increased is Impale, which now has a base of 620%. Now, I don't remember what the old one was. I think it was somewhere in the 200% range, but that is a significant buff. Elemental Arrow is another big one. Its base damage is now at 300%. It was about 100. I think it was 155% prior to patch 2.01, and that is the general rate of increase that we've seen on skills. Chakrams are now 380%. Rapid Fire, I don't think Rapid Fire has changed much, but I know abilities like Cluster Shot and Multi-Shot have definitely seen increases. Sentries have definitely been upgraded as well. Multi-Shot's 360% now. Strafe is actually 400% now. Cluster Arrow is a base of 550. So there's been a lot of flat base damage increases, which definitely makes a lot of builds feel a bit more viable. Now, on top of that, not only have a lot of base damages been increased on the skills, but a lot of runes have had their damage type changed. And if we scroll over through Entangling Shot, we should see some of them. As you can see, this one is poison damage, this one is lightning damage, this one is cold damage, this one's fire damage, and this one's physical damage. So, as you can see, they are trying to break up what kind of damage that, let's say, a Demon Hunter is doing, because there are a lot of items in the game that now have flat increases to things such as fire damage skills, lightning damage skills, and it's basically another way for enabling more build options. If you wanted to go pure lightning damage skills, you could probably do that. I haven't delved too much into it, but probably because I just don't have the right gear to do something such as a fire build or a lightning build or things like that. And for that reason, they've kind of broken these up. For example, this one, entangled enemies take lightning damage over time for 2 seconds. That would definitely be increased. So definitely enables some additional builds. Hopefully, when Reaper of Souls comes out, we could see some more interesting legendaries with these kinds of damage increases on as well. It's on rares, but legendaries probably have more interesting ways of working with some of these items. Now, another thing that's changed is a lot of runes have actually been either completely removed or reworked, or some brand new ones have been added as well. I mean, you can even see some skills that have been reworked, like Bolas is a skill that was it was called Bola Shot before, and it's been slightly reworked. Some of these are new, and some of these have just been buffed or changed. I mean, some of these you recognize, like increasing the explosion radius or augmenting the Bola and the damage it deals, but increases the explosion delay. That one's still in here. Shoots 3 bolas that each deal 160% weapon damage as poisons, but they no longer explode for area damage. I mean, some of these are ones you recognize. It would be pretty hard to go through them all and try and find entirely new runes, but like I said, a lot of the runes have been reworked, so as long as you have more options now, it's actually a lot better. Now, a big thing that's changed is resource costs. In fact, because of that, a lot of skills have actually changed. A big skill that I know changed is this one right here, Evasive Fire. Evasive Fire used to cost hatred, now it generates hatred. It's actually a primary skill, and it's actually been completely reworked. It shoots a spread of bolts that hit the primary target for 160% weapon damage, and 2 additional targets for 80% weapon damage. Not a lot of high weapon damage, but it does have decent hatred regeneration, and of course you do get the backflip if enemies are too close to you. The backflip also doesn't cost discipline. It now just backflips once every 3 seconds. You can take the cooldown off of it, which which is right here. This is obviously a new rune. This removes the cooldown on the backflip, but each backflip costs 2 discipline. Also changes evasive fire's damage into lightning. Example of a new rune and a rework skill with renewed resource costs. Now, another big one is Impale. Now, Impale, we already said, saw the flat buff to its base damage. It's also had its hatred cost slightly reduced down to 20, which definitely makes it a little bit more interesting to use. I think we're definitely going to see a lot more Impale builds since it's been buffed so significantly. Another huge one, by the way, when I say huge, this is probably one of the biggest ones. One of the most important skills that Demon Hunters have been using in the past is Preparation. Preparation, as we know, used to instantly restore all your discipline. It now only restores 30. For example, I have 51 discipline. I cannot fully restore my discipline with this. There is one here, as you can see, permanently increases your maximum discipline by 15, so you can actually get even more discipline with Preparation. And that actually brings up some interesting choices, because I'm still using Backup Plan, which is a chance that its cooldown won't be triggered. But I could also just go for the flat 15 increase and assume that it would take me longer to go through 66 discipline than it would be to really need the backup plan, but there's a lot of different thought that goes into it. The point is, it's not all of your discipline anymore. Now, Companion actually had its all of its costs removed entirely. It's now it's now been completely reworked. I think we should go into Companion on its own separately, because it's been completely reworked. I mentioned it in the last video I did, but it really has been completely reworked. Now, Fan of Knives is another skill, had its hatred cost removed. It's now got a flat 10-second cooldown. It had a cooldown before, but now it's got this. It removed the cooldown but add a 30 hatred cost. It's weird. I don't feel like this is new, but when I read the patch notes, it said Fan of Knives had its hatred cost removed. I don't remember it having a hatred cost. I remember it just having a cooldown before as well, but I don't know. Maybe it was the opposite. Maybe it was hatred before, and then you could give it a cooldown to make it stronger, which actually makes more sense to me. And maybe now it's remove the cooldown but add the 30 hatred cost. I don't know. I've been playing so much of the beta, sometimes things get messed up a little bit. And another big one is Cluster Arrow, which not only had its base damages increased, but it also had its hatred cost reduced by 10. It used to be 50. It is now 40. And we all know that we all love Loaded for Bear. So expect to still see a lot of Loaded for Bear just blowing things up, but I don't think this is as strong as it used to be. But we'll go over that in a little bit. Now, as I said, I wanted to talk about Companions on its own. Actually, first, Sentry. Vengeance we'll talk about when Reaper of Souls comes out, because this skill, you could just even read it right now. This is a new skill that Demon Hunters are going to be getting from 61+. Obviously, we can't look at the runes here, but you can easily find the rune information. Reaper of Souls beta has been out for a very long time. Vengeance, such as, turns into the physical embodiment of Vengeance for 15 seconds. This is basically a giant offensive cooldown for Demon Hunters. You know how sort of like Barbarian has their Super Saiyan form, as I like to call it. Monk has their Unity form. Basically, everybody's going to have that form. You have Archon for Wizard. Well, this is the Demon Hunter version of it. 90-second cooldown. It's got side guns that do 4 additional piercing shots for every shot you do that do 60 weapon damage each. And then it also shoots 4 rockets to nearby enemies that deal damage. And it has some insane runes. And I can't wait to try and build something with cooldown reduction around Vengeance, and hopefully try and find set bonuses or legendaries that can further enhance Vengeance, because it's definitely a really cool skill, but the cooldown is really long, and I'm not a fan of these super long cooldown abilities unless there's ways to reduce it, which there is. So, another thing, sentries also slightly reworked, since we're talking about reworked skills right now. Mostly just had their damages increased, and on top of that, there's a lot of legendaries that now work in tune with sentries, healing nearby allies and creating shields that reduce damage. A lot of this stuff is the same. The chains between them, they now have piercing bolts as one of them, and Spitfire turrets that now shoot homing rockets. Not much of this has changed, but they did. It did go through some significant damage reworks, and it's heavily involved in a lot of legendaries. There's a quiver that lets you put 2 extras down at a time, which is pretty significant. But the big thing we want to talk about, before we talk about Companion actually, Marked for Death, just want to say also, used to be 12% additional damage, is now 20% additional damage, on top of having some of its runes slightly reworked. Now Companion, as I've tried to get to for like the 4th time, Companion has been completely reworked. Along with a lot of other pet-oriented skills in the game, there's now a passive and an active effect for each companion. Now, of course, you have your no rune companion, which doesn't really do anything other than attack for basic damage. On top of that, but you do have Spider, Bat, Boar, Ferret, and Wolf, and each one has a passive and an active. For example, the spider, when you activate it, and keep in mind the active has a 30-second cooldown, as it says on the skill right here. Spider throws a web at all the enemies, slowing them by 80% for 5 seconds. On top of that, the spider physically attacks and slows passively, so it does 140% physical damage and slows enemies by 60% for 3 seconds passively. All the time it does this, but then when you activate it, it'll throw the web. So it's not like you're gonna throw your pet away. It's not like you're gonna sacrifice your pet whenever you activate it. It's basically just gonna allow your pet to do an additional active skill. The bat active instantly gains 50 hatred, which is very good in my opinion, and on top of that, the passive effect is that it does a little bit of damage, but it also gives you extra hatred regen per second. The boar companion is, on hardcore, one of the more popular ones, one that I definitely use a lot. And your boar charges to you, next to your body, so he runs back to you, and taunts all enemies around you. I believe the Templar has an ability like that as well. He has basically one that's on an active effect every 30 seconds, and then he taunts them for 5 seconds. So passively, he does very little damage, but he does grant you life regeneration and increased resistance to all damage types by 20%, so he increases your all res by 20% passively. The Ferret Companions, whenever you activate them, they'll pick up all the health globes and gold within 60 yards, so this can be good for people farming who don't have a lot of radius or don't have a lot of movement speed, and just want to pick stuff up. If you're lazy, maybe if you're playing with friends and they're just running past everything and you're trying to stay caught up. Things like that. Passively, they collect gold for you and increase the gold found on monsters and your movement speed. So these guys are definitely for quick clearing things on top of picking everything up for you. They do collect the gold for you automatically anyway, and they do increase your gold find by 10%. And the final one, another one of my favorites, is the Wolf Companion. Whenever you activate it, it actually grants you and your ally, so it's more of a team-oriented thing. It gives them 30% increased damage for 10 seconds. Now keep in mind, this is a 30-second cooldown. So 1/3 of the time, you can have an extra 30% damage, basically, with the Wolf Companion. But because that effect is so strong, his passive just lets him do basically more auto-attack damage than the rest of your companions at 150% of your weapon damage. So, whew, there's a lot of changes here. I'm actually using the Wolf Companion right now, my hardcore character. So, there's obviously a lot more build options in the game now, and I've already seen... Whoops, I accidentally removed this. Preparation, backup plan, yeah, companion. Go back to the companion. There he is. So obviously there's a lot more build choices in the game now. On top of the active skills, of course, you have to look at the passive skills before you can decide on a build, though. Now, passive skills haven't seen a great deal of attention comparatively to the active skills because they are basically passive skills. One change, for example, sharpshooter's not 3%, it's now 4%, so this actually got buffed, surprisingly. It was heavily abused at the beginning of the game. Ballistics now also shoots a homing rocket whenever you attack, which is actually good for rocket and grenading builds. This is definitely a great passive for those things. Custom Engineer hasn't really changed much at all. Grenadier, still not something you want to use on hardcore. Well, you do if you're doing a grenade build. Explosion size and damage now. Night Stalker, Brooding, 1.5% life per second. Thrill of the Hunt, every 6 seconds your next skill will cost hatred, your next skill will immobilize. Blood Vengeance increases your maximum hatred, and you gain 30 hatred and 3 discipline. Those numbers seem to be a little bit higher. So there hasn't been any super significant changes. Another one with Archery, the second hand crossbow giving 1 hatred per second, 5 critical hit chance, 50 crit damage, 8% increased damage on a bow. Obviously, a lot of this stuff has just had slight numerical tweaks. On top of that, we do have 3 new passives that we'll be able to use in Reaper of Souls. This one, basically, you'll do more damage at the start of a fight. If an enemy is above 75% of their health, you'll deal more damage. This can actually be very much used on lower difficulties to one-shot enemies because you'll have that 40% additional damage. You just hit them with your hardest ability and they might just fall over. It's good for really pushing down their HP right at the beginning. Awareness is the same thing as Sharpshooter, but with your dodge chance. So basically, if you're not getting hit, in case you are going to get hit, Awareness can protect you. Gain 6% dodge chance every second. The bonus is reset 1 second after you successfully dodge an attack. And it's basically the same as Sharpshooter, but more on the defensive line. And Single Out, not one of my favorites. Gain 25% critical hit chance against enemies who are more than 20 yards away from other enemies. This is good for maybe boss running like Diablo and maybe GOM and just more boss runs to me. This says boss runs, maybe even Ubers, more than it says just general farming. And because of the freedom of changing your build now on the fly, it's definitely something that you can consider. All right, so with all these new reworks, obviously, there's room for new builds. You know, you don't just have to do the generic, like, I guess in the case of Demon Hunter, just the generic ball lightning build, and, or you could do the loaded for bear build, or the, just hungering arrow with, like, 5 defensive ability builds. You now have a bit more options that are more viable on the higher difficulties, like the sentry build, and in my case, what I like to call the slow build. Now, the slow build is something that's been in the game for a while, but it's far more effective now than it used to be for several reasons. One, both of the abilities that are key to it, which are Entangling Shot and Elemental Arrow, have both been buffed on their base damages, so it's definitely more reasonable to do this. Now, Entangling Shot, like I said, it's now 200% of its damage, but on top of that, I still run with the additional Hatred, which was pretty much key to how it was before patch 2.01. You do have some other options like increasing the slow amount or increasing the slow duration. On top of that, you can just go straight with additional damage on Shock Pillar, or you can entangle and up to 4 enemies, which, you know, sort of enables you to do more damage to more enemies with the build works. But I prefer to go with the extra Hatred. Elemental Arrow is pretty much the bread and butter of the build. Elemental Arrow, now, because it's a slow build, I do run Frost Arrow. Now, Frost Arrow is something that's very interesting to use. It actually has one of the higher base weapon damages of the abilities. As you can see, 300, 300, 300, 300, but this one has 330. It's a little bit harder to hit with than some of the other elemental arrows, but as you can guess, it does in fact slow enemy movement speed. It only slows it for 1 second. And for that reason, when you're spamming Elemental Arrow, you want to make sure you can get off more than 2 attacks per second. Because if you shoot them and they're not already slowed, that extra damage is pretty much not going to waste. You could also prep them with Entangling Shot before using Frost Arrow if you want to ensure. But in order to ensure, you could just spam Frost Arrow and keep the damage bonus up the entire time from one of our passives that we're going to be talking about. You pretty much want to get to 2 attacks per second. It is definitely the easiest way to make use of this build. Now, because of that, I do have on my gear, which we'll go over in a sec, I am using double hand crossbows, and I have a lot of attack speed on my gear. As you can see, attack speed on my belt. I have attack speed in other places too. I have attack speed on my ring. I have attack speed on my gloves. I just have enough attack speed to get to the point where I can actually get 2 attacks per second. We'll go over my gear for this build in a second, though. Now, as for my other 4 skills, some of the stuff is standard. I believe almost every build is going to be making use of preparation, either smokescreen, vault, or shadow power. I don't think you'll use more than one of those anymore. And a companion. Not using a companion is fine, but I personally prefer to have the companion, whether I need it for the life regeneration, whether I need it for the hatred regeneration. It can really help enable builds that might be kind of tight on resource costs while you work on lowering your resource costs, whether it be through Paragon levels or gear. Now, these 4 abilities are extremely interchangeable. This is not, these, like I said, these 2 skills are the bread and butter. These are really more of personal preference. Like for me, I prefer to go with Reign of Vengeance, and not only that, but Reign of Vengeance has a rune that stuns. It stuns them in place for 5 seconds. It lasts for 5 seconds and it stuns the enemy's hit for 2 seconds, but it usually ends up locking them in place for the entire duration of the effect, which is 5 seconds. Which gives me opportunity to lay into enemies with Elemental Arrow. Now, because we'll show the weaknesses of Frost Arrow and why I enjoy using Reign of Vengeance so much just as soon as we go over the rest of the build. Rest of this stuff is basic, though. Preparation, backup plan, chance that the cooldown will not be triggered, and to get Discipline back in case I need it. The only thing I'm really using Discipline on is Smokescreen, so these 2 abilities are basically holding each other hand in hand. Which is why I say, if you're not using your Smokescreen a lot, Preparation is definitely interchangeable with something else, perhaps even Vault, if you would prefer to have that. But I don't like having Vault and Smokescreen and Preparation on my action bar skills. It just seems like too much defense and not a lot, and not a lot of it's ever necessary. And then, of course, in my final slot, I run Companion. Depending on how I feel, I'm either running with the bonus damage from Wolf, or depending on what difficulty I'm on, sometimes I'll run with the Boar for the increased life regeneration and the increased resistance to all damage types. And on top of that, for the taunt. Can never complain about that. Now, that's it for active skills. Now for passive skills, I wish I had this 4th slot that we get at level 70, because ideally for this build there are 4 passives that you want, depending on what difficulty you're playing on. If you're playing on softcore, what I have right now will work fine. Call of the Week Increases damage against slows enemies by 20%. This is mainly the reason why you want the 2 attack speed per second in order to actually get an attack off while the enemies are actually slowed with Elemental Arrow. Archery depends on your weapon. You can use pretty much any weapon with this build depending on how much gear you have. I like running double hand crossbows on hardcore, so I have the 1 hatred per second, which goes in hand with my elemental arrow because, well, I need the hatred regen, and I have 5% critical hit chance because I have the first hand crossbow. And, hand bro. Anyway, Perfectionist reduces the discipline cost of all skills by 10%. This isn't really that significant. I more or less use it for the life, armor, and resistance to all elements. Like I said, these things are interchangeable if you are on softcore. These are more for hardcore. You can run things such as steady aim since it is a slow build. Using steady aim instead of Perfectionist can actually be very effective. On top of that, Thrill of the Hunt and mobilizing targets can also be very effective. There's really not any one passive that is absolutely needed for this. And of course, if you want to run a different slow build with Spike Trap, Caltrops, Grenades, or Sentry, you can of course use Numbing Traps. This isn't the only type of slow build out there. As you can see from this passive, you can work around it a little bit. Now, ideally on hardcore, I would want Cull of the Weak, Archery, Perfectionist, and Brooding for this. Even though Brooding requires you to stand still, I do a lot of orb walking, which we'll go over in a second. So Brooding would definitely be a good one for me. Now, I'm going to take a drink of water real quick, and then we're going to check out the build in action. Alright. Now, keep in mind, I am on Expert for the sake of survival. This is a hardcore character. And Blizzard has made a public announcement that their servers are sometimes having connection errors. So, we all don't want to lose hardcore characters to connection because I was like, hey, I can do Torment 2 with this build. And then I get disconnected and it's bad news bears. I really don't like running Torment without friends on hardcore. So, we are on Expert. So, we're going to go into the core of Ariat, and you're going to see... Now, what I mean by orb walking is this. Is shift clicking and doing an attack. Move, attack, move, attack. Because I have such high attack speed with my double hand crossbows, I can actually get through this place pretty quickly. I also have a lot of base movement speed on my gear, so I can actually move pretty quickly. So now Frost Arrow, as you can see, Frost Arrow pretty much just arcs back and hits everything behind the first enemy that you swing it at. And what that allows to do, now this is how you deal with elites. Watch. You stun them, and then you set it up, and you just slow them to death. I don't even need to like be a distance away from them because of the difficulty. But now, and there you go. It's really simple. Best case scenario is you'll stun them with Rain of Vengeance, keep them still for the entire duration, and then slow the hell out of them while you just bombard them with damage. Because they are taking more damage because they're slowed, Rain of Vengeance, which already does massive amounts of damage, is doing even more damage. On top of your Frost Arrows just laying into them. So we should be able to find another elite real quick. Here we go. Here's more trash pulls. As you can see, Frost Arrow arcing back like that. Very, very effective for clearing out. Now, one weakness to Frost Arrow is because it only hits targets that are behind when it shatters. You really have to... Hold on. Let's... I use that. Alright. Come on. There we go. And now, just lay into them. As you can see... That's what it looks like best case scenario on Expert. Obviously, like I said, I can do Torment 2 with this build, so I'm actually kind of just bullying these bad guys. But as I was saying, the weakness about Frost Arrow is that if enemies aren't lined up properly, it doesn't arc back properly and it won't hit as many enemies. So you really have to stay on the move and be constantly repositioning with this build, unless you have a good position, in which case you can just sit still and wait for the good times to roll in. So another weakness of this build, as you're going to see with me fighting Azmodan, is it doesn't have a lot of single target damage. Sure, Rain of Vengeance will do a lot of damage, and Frost Arrow doesn't do bad damage, but it takes a little bit longer to do boss killing, especially because I'm using double hand crossbows, which, by the way, we'll go over the gear after I kill Azmodan real quickly. Also, Azmodan, as you'll see right here, has had his fight a little bit reworked, but not too significantly. Actually, it's pretty significant. So as you can see, Rain of Vengeance is doing its work, but other than that, I'm pretty much just laying into him with Frost Arrow. There's not really much more to it. I don't even need to move out of these things, I don't think. Yeah, 300 damage. I'll pass. Yeah, well, that can always end poorly. And see, this is really one of the only weaknesses, is that it doesn't really do that significant of boss damage. But it still is okay for boss, for bosses. You don't really need to change your build up too much if you want to do bosses. so I'm not going to click that. So gear-wise, what am I using? How am I making this build work? Well, to get my 2.0, it's now 2.11, it was 2.03 when I made the build. I'm using a Natalia's Slayer. As you can see, it's got extremely high base damage, dex, maximum discipline, and a socket. I don't have a high enough gem to do anything more than the critical hit damage because I got rid of a lot of that stuff before I quit. My offhand is the Dinetta's Revenge. This is not the one I would prefer to use. I would prefer to use a Dawn, but this is actually pretty good because it's got life per hit, hatred regeneration, it's got a socket, it's got dexterity. I need a newer one. This is an old Dinetta's Revenge before Loot 2.0. If I could get a new one, I would much prefer that, assuming it still has things like life per hit and hatred regeneration. Still looking for a new offhand, but the basic gist of it is a one-hander and a two one-handers is definitely good. You can run a one-hander and a quiver if you so desire, but I prefer just two one-handers. It's just more my style of gameplay. For boots, I managed to roll dex, vitality, movement speed, and elemental arrow damage by 14%. I believe the maximum is 15%, so I rolled good on that. And then a lot of this other stuff just has basic Demon Hunter stats. For example, Blackthorn's legs, I have dex, life percentage, life per hit, and all resistance, as well as some golden pickup radius. Natalia's ring with dexterity, attack speed, and life regeneration. Again, hardcore itemization, so it didn't really bother me too much. It actually rolled really high on the life regeneration. Also had a socket, which I decided for the sake of this to put all resistance into it with the new gems. I also have this ring, which is dexterity, life, critical hit damage, and life per hit. It also drains life from the enemies around me. I haven't really seen it be too effective yet, but I'm not going to complain. Hellcat Waistguard has attack speed on it, so I wanted to run with this. I actually picked this up, so it was actually perfect for the build I was trying to work on, and it was almost like the game knew. Smart loot. Body piece absolutely sucks. Don't take this as a good example of a body piece. You probably want a Natalia's body piece if I could find one. Dexterity, vitality, armor, and life regeneration. Not bad for hardcore, but just not what I'm looking for. Wrists, critical hit chance, you still pretty much want dex, vitality, resistance, and critical hit chance is definitely good statistics to have on a bracelet. Of course, some legendary bracelets will have more interesting stats that may be better for this, but this is the basics. Gloves, dex, no vitality, all res, attack speed, and critical hit chance. Just ran with that, sort of like a trifecta with no vitality. This is almost some Diablo 3 launch type of gear that you would see. No vitality. Don't even, all res would have been not even worth it. This is something that I just crafted because I had crap shoulders from before. Dex vitality, does area damage on hit, which isn't bad. It definitely enables me to do even more AoE damage than the build already enables, and reducing the cooldown of skills on Reign of Vengeance and the Wolf Companion. Can't complain about that by 5%. Not really that significant. That's like 1.5 seconds, but every little bit counts. My amulet is another old amulet that I haven't been able to replace yet. It's got 10% crit chance is the main reason, but it also has flat damage and vitality, which isn't bad, but you can get way better amulets than this. So don't take this as an example of the amulet of choice. And a headpiece, another thing that is still pretty gimp, but it's got high dex, high vitality, armor, which is okay for hardcore, and then chakram damage. I would prefer elemental arrow damage or a socket. One of those two would have definitely been way better, and the armor I could have definitely done without. But that's my gear. You can make this build work with a variety of gear. It doesn't require a high amount of gear, and it's very effective on hardcore, moderately effective on softcore. It's just a fun little build that I put together really quick. Very, very basic build. This is basically your beginner's build for Demon Hunter if you're not running on, especially if you're running on hardcore. You can run this build, and it should keep you alive pretty much. Now, pros of the build: high AoE damage, high mobility, definitely able to keep distance between enemies, except for the ones like phase beasts that teleport through to you, or enemies with Waller, which are definitely a big problem, but we do have smokescreen for that, thankfully. On top of that, we do have preparation, backup plans. You can make some nifty escapes. It also has a lot of lockdown because of the Reign of Vengeance, which makes it good for both solo play and team play. You can absolutely decimate enemies with Reign of Vengeance plus Elemental Arrow, Frost Arrow spam. Now, some weaknesses: its single target damage isn't as high when Reign of Vengeance isn't up. It's a very big part. On top of that, it still is highly defensive, so you may find yourself only using one or two abilities most of the time. So, other than the fact that Frost Arrow just looks awesome whenever you use it, sometimes it's not always good. Another thing is, because of Frost Arrow's nature, having to constantly reposition yourself, this requires a lot of movement and repositioning. It's also much better in narrow corridors where hitting the enemy in front will guarantee you hit all the enemies behind him with Frost Arrow, which will hit a maximum of 11 targets. The initial target plus 10 other targets. So, high AoE damage, decent single target damage, not so good boss damage, good survivability, good kiting, but at the same time requires a lot of movement. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this build. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share for more builds that are going to be coming up for more classes. Definitely going to be trying to explore a lot of the other options, but keep in mind that a lot of them are enabled by legendaries. So when Reaper of Souls comes out is when we'll really see a lot of the awesome builds. I mean, just an example right here. Crider Shot is a bow I picked up. Elemental Arrow now generates 4 hatred. So that I could basically, if I could find a good enough quiver and I could definitely get enough attack speed and enough sockets to make this work, I could endlessly Elemental Arrow pretty much with the Frost Shot. Also has knockback on hit, which just isn't bad. So expect a lot more builds to be coming in the future. The game launches very soon, so I'm very much looking forward to jumping in and getting a lot of new builds. But also, be sure to follow me on Facebook and Twitter. You can ask me questions, shoot me ideas for your builds. I can try them out. I can do my best to try and get the right items for them if you have an idea, but not necessarily the time or the gear to do them. And of course, follow me on Twitch where I do live stream. Been streaming Final Fantasy lately, but expect a variety over the coming year. But anyway, guys, thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.